I'm Jeroen van Meij and welcome to my lecture series on computer and network security. In this video on authentication and access control, I will talk about intrusion detection, which is a method to detect malicious users entering the system without proper authorization. And before I go deeper into the concept of intrusion detection, let's define what is an intruder. An intruder is also referred to as a hacker or a cracker, and it is someone who performs unauthorized actions in a network. It is, together with viruses, one of the most publicized threats in security. And three classes of intruders have been identified. The first one is a masquerader. A masquerader is an individual who is not authorized to use the computer and who penetrates a system's access controls to exploit a legitimate user's account. A misfeasor is a legitimate user who accesses data, programs, resources for which their access is not authorized. Finally, a clandestine user is an individual who seizes supervisory control of the system and uses this control to evade auditing and access control or suppress audit collection. A masquerader is usually an outsider, while a misfeasor is usually an insider. The clandestine user can be either an outsider or an insider. And these intrusion attacks can be either benign or malicious. There are many examples of intrusions. For example, a malicious user could gain root access to an email server. A user could get access to the files behind a website and deface these websites. A user could access and crack passwords, copy a database, view sensitive information, and so on. There are many ways to prevent intrusions. For example, you could use authentication methods, encrypt transmitted or stored data, use firewalls, and so on. However, in some cases, an intruder will manage to break through these first line of defenses and gain illegitimate access to the system without proper authorization. In such a case, an intrusion detection system serves as a second line of defense. It can be used to detect intruders and notify network and system administrators so they can take action to stop the intrusion. And intrusion detection systems usually rely on measuring and quantifying the behavior of users. And the behavior of authorized users is generally different from the behavior of intruders. And based on this difference, the system can detect intruders. Obviously, some overlap exists, so the goal of an intrusion detection system is to detect intruders as accurately as possible in face of this overlapping behavior with authorized users. And this overlap can lead to so-called false positives or negatives. A false positive is an authorized user that is identified as an intruder, and a false negative is an intruder that's not correctly identified. Obviously, an IDS should minimize false positives and negatives as much as possible. There are two main types of intrusion detection. The first one is statistical anomaly detection, which involves collecting data relating to the behavior of legitimate users over a period of time, and then using statistical tests to observe behavior of other users and determine with confidence whether or not this behavior is legitimate. Second is a rule-based intrusion detection, which involves attempting to decide a set of rules or attack patterns that can be used to decide whether or not given behavior is that of an intruder. This is also referred to as signature detection. And I have a question for you related to these two types of intrusion detection. Which of them is best suited to identify masquerade attacks? Recall that a masquerader is usually an external party that pretends to be an internal user. Is it statistical anomaly detection, rule or signature-based detection? They are both equally suited, or neither of them is suited to detect this kind of intruder. Feel free to pause the video if you want to think about the answer. And let's take a look at the correct answer. And the correct answer is A, statistical anomaly detection. This is because an outsider that performs a masquerade attack usually is not well aware of how internal users behave, and therefore it's very difficult for them to mimic normal user behavior. On the other hand, they could most likely derive which rules need to be abided to, so they are better able to circumvent rule-based intrusion detection. There are two main subtypes of statistical anomaly detection. The first one is threshold-based detection, where user behavior is monitored to determine thresholds independent of the specific user to detect abnormal frequency of occurrences, for example, to detect port scans. However, different users may show different behavior, so in general it's very hard to determine a average behavior for a legitimate user. Also, not only the frequency of occurrence should be used, but also the time between occurrences. Second type is profile-based anomaly detection, where a user profile is created either for an individual user or a group of users to detect changes in that behavior over time. And if abnormal changes are detected based on past actions, then a possible intrusion has occurred. At the basis of anomaly detection lies the so-called audit records, which keep track of actions performed by users, when they occurred, how often they occur, time between events, and how much resources of the network they consume. These audit records together then form a profile of user behavior that can be used to create a user profile or to determine thresholds. Different statistical tests can be used together with anomaly detection, such as the mean or standard deviation, multivariate tests that combine multiple variables, a Markov process that estimates the transitions from one type of action to another, time series that monitoring the time between events, and so on. And to make this more concrete, let's take a look at some often used patterns used for statistical anomaly detection. We could, for example, look at login or session activity of the user. For example, how often the user logs in, based on the date, the time, from where they log in, the last time since they logged in, or the number of successive wrong password attempts. For example, if a user always logs in from one country and suddenly there's a login from another country across the world, this could be considered an anomaly. And for example, an email could be sent to the user to notify them that there was a login at a strange location. The user can then verify whether it was them or not. Other information that can be used is related to the commands or program execution activity of the user. For example, if the user tries to execute programs to which they are not authorized, or if they suddenly utilize way more resources than before. Also related to access to files in the network, for example, how many files have been read, written, created, deleted, or if the user tries to access files to which they are not authorized. In terms of rule-based intrusion detection, there are two main types as well. The first one is rule-based anomaly detection. This one is a bit similar to statistical anomaly detection, but instead of deriving behavior of specific users, it derives general rules that can be used to model legitimate behavior by looking at historical audit records. The second one is rule-based penetration identification, which defines rules specific to certain machines or operating systems that identify specific attacks against known weaknesses and vulnerabilities in these systems. This is very useful to prevent known types of attacks. However, it's not very good at detecting unknown types of attacks. And although intrusion detection can be done on a single host, modern enterprise networks consist of many hosts where intrusion detection needs to be performed. By doing this in a distributed way and coordinating it through a central manager, attacks can be better detected. There are three types of entities involved in distributed intrusion detection. The first one is the host agent, which serves to collect audit records as a background process on one of the systems, which could be, for example, a computer or a server. It collects these records, which contain the actions of the users on the system, and sends them to the central manager. Second is the LAN monitoring agent, which performs the same actions but for traffic on the network. So it collects audit records based on what is happening on the network, for example, traffic passing through a router. It also transmits these records to the central agent, which then correlates reports from different agents to detect more complicated intrusions. And let's take a closer look at the internal workings of this agent module that runs on a host. Usually it is integrated into the operating system, so it collects audit information about what's happening in the OS. Security relevant information is then filtered out and non-security related information is dropped. The information is reformatted into so-called host audit records, which are a standardized way to represent security audit records. A logic module is used together with an analysis module to determine notable activity based, for example, on signatures or anomaly detection. If information is noteworthy and potentially could be an intrusion, an alert is generated and the information, these records, are sent to the central manager. As such, the central manager is only notified if a potential intrusion has been detected and only with the relevant information to that intrusion. A relatively recent innovation in terms of intrusion detection are so-called honeypots. Honeypots are decoy systems designed to lure potential attackers away from the actual critical systems of a network. Usually these honeypots are more easy to attack and have some known vulnerabilities embedded on purpose. And they serve multiple purposes. First of all, they divert attackers from the actual critical systems of the network as they attract the attackers to them. Moreover, they allow administrators to collect information about attackers because the administrators will already see an attacker is trying to access the network when they gain access to the honeypot. And therefore, they allow early detection of potential attacks. Honeypots can be positioned in different parts of the network. For example, a honeypot can be positioned outside of the external firewall. This allows detection to attackers connecting to unused IP addresses. Second, a honeypot can be positioned inside the demilitarized zone or DMZ behind the external firewall together with externally accessible services like a web server, an email server, and so on. Third and last, the honeypot could be positioned inside the internal network. This allows catching internal attacks from someone from inside the internal network and misconfigurations of the external and internal firewall. However, positioning a honeypot inside a DMZ or internal network could be dangerous, as when an attacker compromises this honeypot, they already have access to the internal network or DMZ, and it might be easier for them to compromise other hosts in these networks. On the other hand, positioning the honeypot outside the external firewall doesn't allow detecting certain types of attacks. And this ends my video on intrusion detection. In the next and last video on access control, I will talk about IP security or IPsec.